All right, it's a Monday, all right? I'm feeling the Monday, personally and just from the student body, all right? It's the end of the semester. There are a lot of assignments and papers due. I get it. Any questions about anything upcoming, content-wise? Yeah?
Yeah, sort of about, are we going to have like a study session before this exam and the finals, or how will we handle studying for the finals?
Yeah, so the last day of class will be a study session in class, just like we've been doing normally. And I'll probably also do an additional study session, likely that same Wednesday, a little bit later in the day for anybody who needs additional help with practice. Yeah, yep, good question. All right, as a reminder, I do have those cumulative questions up on Moodle. All the cumulative material will come from those questions. I also posted the study guide, right? I tried to post it a little bit early because I know you have a lot of things to juggle right now. That being said, I posted it so early that I don't even have the lectures made for the last of the content. So I will update that study guide as I update my lectures. All right, and it's big and bolded on there. That is not a complete study guide. It will be updated, but you have something to start with. All right, well, let's talk about our topic today, all right, which will be speciation, which I find a fun topic. There's a lot of definitions to go over and concepts, but I think the concepts are more easily understandable, right? Because we can see them play out in nature, even just walking around on campus sometimes. So identification of species. In order to talk about what makes a species, we need to know just a little bit of some background terminology. All right, so microevolution. This is where we're really talking about change of allele frequencies in a population on a small scale. All right, so this is where we might see natural selection playing out. Right, maybe like in this image here, we're seeing alleles changing in terms of what kind of dog is bred, right? Which is different than macroevolution. So macroevolution is the type of evolution that causes new species to arise, right? So it's basically accumulation of a lot of microevolutionary changes that over time, we're going to get a new species, right? So definition of species, which there are many ways you can define a species, and we will get to that. But broadly speaking, it's a group of organisms that share a distinctive set of attributes in nature and likely cannot interbreed with another species. And we'll get to that aspect. And then finally, we're going to talk about speciation. All right, so this is the term associated with the formation of a new species. And so that would be macroevolution by means of many, many microevolutionary changes. All right, so we got some of these definitions out of the way, right? We'll talk about what makes a species and what events can lead to speciation. Right, if we think about species on Earth, there's a lot of them, all right? We currently have identified 1.8 million species, which is a ton. But we think there could be up to 50 million species on Earth that we just haven't gone around to identifying yet. So there's a lot of different species out there. What makes it so difficult to define what is a species is not only we could define what's a species, but there are a lot of subspecies out there. So these are species that display traits that are different from each other, but not so different enough to be a totally different species. Tigers are a great example of this. So tigers are all the same species. They are all Panthera tigris, right? But there's so many different types of subspecies, right? So we have Tigris tigris or Tigris corbeti, right? As well as several others, right? They're the same species, but we would say they're a subspecies because they're slightly different, just not different enough to be a new species. Right? We can also talk about species in terms of being an ecotype. All right, so these would be plants or bacteria most commonly that are adapted to very specific local environments. They are the same species, but depending on the environment that they're living in, they might look a little different or grow a little different. So a good example here are these plants. These are all the same species, but they're all living in various levels of having water. So various levels into this lake or this river, right? One of which doesn't even grow if it's submerged below water. Another ecotype, again, same species, can be completely submerged and in very deep water, right? And still be able to grow. We would say that they're the same species, different ecotype, because they're growing in different environments. All right, so when we're distinguishing a species, not only are there subspecies and ecotypes, but there's just a lot of different characteristics that we can use to define a species. So we're going to be looking at sexually reproducing species. So members of one species will not be able to interbreed with another species. And we can look at a whole host of characteristics, whether this is morphological, ability to interbreed, molecular features, ecological factors, right? All of these play into how to differentiate a species. And the type of characteristics that you would use really depends on the species in question, right? Am I looking at a bacteria? Am I looking at a mammal, all right? Those two different types of organisms might require you to use different types of characteristics. So we're going to go over those characteristics, all right? So morphological traits are one way that you could distinguish a species, right? So these are the physical characteristics of an organism, or what an organism looks like, right? So if I'm looking at my frogs here, by show of fingers, how many species of frogs do you think you are looking at here? So we have a blue frog, a yellow frog, a green frog with spots, and another green frog with spots. How many species do you think there are? I see anywhere from 1 to 2 to 4. Yeah, right? It's hard to tell. These are actually 3 different species, right? The top 2 are the same species, even though they look vastly different from each other, right? These are poison dart frog species. The bottom 2, even though they look very similar to each other, these are actually different species, all right? So this plays into some of the drawbacks of these morphological traits. Sometimes you can look at an organism and say, yeah, that's definitely a different species. It looks totally different, right? Other times, it's really hard to tell. And so when we're thinking about these morphological traits, we have things we need to consider. Like, how many traits are we going to look at when looking at defining a species? Are we just going to look at the color of the frog? Or are we also going to look to see if they have webbed feet or not? Or maybe the color of their eyes? How many of those traits do we use? Yeah?
I thought species was like an animal as a whole, and the subspecies were like the different types of animals. So they're all called frogs, like they're all
So they're all frogs, so they'd probably be in the same genus or family when we start talking about how we classify organisms. But they're different species depending on what we'll get to that. Maybe they behave differently. Maybe they can't breed with one another. That's a great thing to consider, right? Sometimes they're subspecies because they look similar enough, but they're not different enough, and that plays into how different do they have to be a species, right? It's one of those tricky bits of defining a species, right? We might have species where the traits are along a continuum, like these poison dart frogs. They can be many different colors, right, which is a phenotypic difference, but they are the same species, right? Maybe we might need to consider how different do they have to be in order to be called a different species. So what degree of dissimilarity are we going to use? And like we looked about at these frogs here, right? Members of the same species can look very different, but members of different species can look very similar, right? So some of the drawbacks of using just morphological characteristics to define a species. We can also use whether or not they're reproductively isolated, all right? So if they physically cannot breed with one another, all right? So we're preventing successful breeding with another species. So if they can't breed, we would say they are 2 different species, all right? but there are drawbacks to this as well, right? It may be very difficult to determine in nature if they can breed with one another, right? If they're separated with a river here, maybe it's obvious, right? Maybe they physically cannot cross a river or a giant canyon and breed with one another, right? But again, this could be difficult because maybe in nature, this river is shallow enough at one point that they could actually cross. And we just didn't know that, right? So maybe their ranges do overlap. Maybe even if their ranges interlap and they have the potential to breed with one another, they simply don't for whatever reason, right? We can't apply this to species that asexually reproduce, right? So that's a whole other ball game. And we can't apply this to extinct species because we simply don't know what their behaviors were because they were extinct. Yeah, question.
Does this not apply to like zygers, or like whatever they're called, lion tigers, or like?
We will get to that. Yes, so breeding between two species that can actually produce an offspring, right, that look a little bit different, we'll get to that. Hang tight on that question. So primarily this method is used to distinguish different species that might be closely related, but physically cannot reproduce with one another. A good example are these two plants. They look very similar, but they are so isolated, they would never be able to breed together. We would consider these a different species. All right, we can look at molecular features as well. All right, so we're looking at these genetic features to identify similarities and differences among populations. So we're looking at DNA sequences, or maybe the order of genes along a chromosome. Maybe it's the chromosome structure. All right, so are the first chromosome that we see, is that going to be really long? Is it going to be really short? Maybe it's the chromosome number, right? Some individuals, I think that's fruit flies, only have 8 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? This is commonly used for species that are hard to work with or hard to distinguish based on morphological traits. So cyanobacteria here is a great example. They all look really similar to each other, and the only way to distinguish them apart is through DNA sequencing, right? The drawback to this one is that it can be difficult to determine the level of difference you need to be a different species. So if the genetic code is 99% similar, is that 1% enough to make it a different species? Or does it have to be 5% or 10%? Right? It's hard to draw that line sometimes. Right, the last factor we'll talk about are ecological factors. So these are where we are using the environment to inform us whether or not they're different species. And so we're really looking at their habitat. So these birds here, we would identify the difference in species based on the habitat that they use to forage for food. Even though they look really similar, maybe one bird species only forages for foods in the treetops, and another species might forage for food purely underneath the tree, right? They have that difference of type of habitat that they're utilizing. Many bacterial species we will use to define different species based on the habitat that the bacteria is in, right? Maybe it's inside of an organism, maybe it grows in the soil, those types of different habitats. The drawback is some species can be what we call very plastic, right? Plastic meaning that they can adapt to a lot of different conditions, right? So we might define one species based on their habitat, but they can adapt to a different habitat, and they can have a different form associated with that habitat. And so it gets a little blurry and hard to distinguish, right? Because they're able to adapt so well to new inputs to their environments. All right, let's do a review here. I want you to list of all the different methods of classification we have talked about, the advantages and disadvantages of both. one to use. Mules, we'll talk about mules.
I love mules. Why can't mules survive but like
What do you mean that they can't survive?
well like more like health like they're not like able to survive like tiger than lion. But I want to know why mules can survive better than tigers can.
It might be what we'll talk about is hybrid breakdown, that from two different species, there's just so many genetic problems that.
Like tigers or horses and donkeys would be something like or something. Is that like what you mean?
Yeah, they don't have the hybrid breakdown, and likely because they're very similar, but their offspring's not fertile, so it's.
Do you know why that is?
I don't know,
Like
because
more
of
like the two
genetics.
different like chromosomes
Yeah.
from there.
Could be a reason, I don't know how many chromosomes they each have, or maybe
got my
the
answer.
genes on the chromosomes are differently arranged.
Yeah.
Love
Maybe just like
mules.
huge.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe like it's scary. I feel so
That's a good question.
I could this picture. Picture of tiger and lion together.
Over time, like if you want your dog to, like if you breed dogs, then you change them to morphological, like there's maybe because
Uh-huh.
and that's vaccination maybe because you're choosing. So if you can change 3 of these factors, but not the species, right?
Yeah. There's still a
So would those breeds be
You could just be like, oh, because this one
We'll get to that in the next few
was
slides
over
over here.
here, or this one was
Can you get a sense like how much of each of these traits you want to
But the drawbacks
in
of that.
determining using
Yeah.
They,
I mean, I'm guessing those substantial morphological features, right?
It totally depends. There is not a straight answer here because there's so much going on. Yes. Right. All right, so when we looked at all these traits here, those morphological traits, what is an advantage of using this type of classification? Do you need any special equipment?
It's easy to visualize.
Yeah, it's really easy, right? It's really easy to see, right? But what are the disadvantages? There's a lot. Sometimes it's not easy to tell, right? We can physically see these features, but sometimes the features are very similar, right? How many traits are you going to look at when determining is it a different species? Or how dissimilar does it have to be in order to be a different species, right? There's a lot of different drawbacks to think about here. What about reproductive isolation? What would be an advantage here of using this method?
species can't interbreed with each other.
Yeah, you could simply observe if species don't interbreed with each other, right? They can look similar, but they don't interbreed. We call them a different species, right? But the disadvantages is that it's really hard to tell sometimes, right? It's not always super obvious. Maybe they're able to breed, and they just choose not to, right? What about these molecular features? What are some advantages with looking at molecular features? Any guesses? I'll pull it up here, right? Advantage is that we can look at the DNA to maybe distinguish species if they look very similar to each other, right? So bacteria are great examples. Bacteria, they can look very similar to each other, but if you look at their genetic code, they might be very dissimilar, right? Disadvantages, it's hard to tell how dissimilar they need to be in order to be a new species, right? Where do you draw the line? I would also put in there that some of the disadvantages is that doing a lot of this molecular work can be costly, right? And finally, ecological factors. What could be an advantage to using the ecological factors?
Like you can like look at their behaviors.
Yeah, we can make a lot of observational inferences here. So if they use different habitats for food, we can say that they're different from each other, right? Or if they use different habitats for other resources in the environment, right? Disadvantages being that a lot of species have a lot of variation and they can utilize a lot of different habitats, right? So if we think about those birds where I said some of them might eat at the tops of the trees, some of them might eat at the bottom of the trees. Well, maybe if there's nothing at the top of the trees, those birds could easily adapt and find a new food source at the bottom of the tree, all right, even though it's not their preference. All right, so we looked at a lot of different ways that we can tell if a species is different. And a lot of times we often use a combination of all of those traits together in what we would say is a species concept, right? So it's a way to define how you are defining a species, right? How or what approach you are using to distinguish one species apart from another. There are many, many species concepts, right? Some of the more popular ones are the ecological species concepts. It's really emphasizing the ecological roles, right? So how they are, what roles they're playing in the environment, right? So these birds, do they inhabit very deep water, very shallow water, or they don't inhabit the water at all, right? We can look at the evolutionary lineage concept. Press the wrong button, now it doesn't want to play with me. There we go. The evolutionary lineage concept, where we look at their evolutionary history, right? So when did they evolve? Who did they evolve from? Who are they related to? We would look at these phylogenetic trees to kind of figure things out, right? Morphological species concept is another big one where you just look and are they different, right? This is applied a lot of times in fossils, right? Because we can really only see what they looked like. We can't tell their behaviors or maybe even what ecological niche they preferred, right? So these are both trilobites, but we can see that there are slight differences. So there are different species of trilobites, right? There's also the biological species concept, which is the big one and the one that we are going to emphasize because it's the one that's most commonly used. And this is all based on sexual reproduction, right? So it's a species is going to be a group of individuals that have the potential to interbreed with one another, right? Not only do they have the potential to interbreed, their offspring is going to be fertile and viable, right? So their offspring can go on to breed and make more offspring, right? And that they cannot successfully interbreed with other members of a different species, right? So we're really looking at reproductive isolation when we're talking about the biological species concepts. It's the most popular one out there. It is not the only one out there, right? So if we're thinking about that biological species concept, we're really focusing on this reproductive isolation mechanism, all right? So mechanisms preventing interbreeding, and it's one of the major ways that a new species can arise, right? And we're really looking at the consequence of genetic changes over time in response to an environment that can lead to that potential to not be able to interbreed with each other, right? There's a lot of reproductive isolating mechanisms out there, right? We're going to go through them all. We could broadly separate them into two categories, right? Whether or not you can physically mate with somebody and produce a zygote, right? And if you produce a zygote, whether that zygote will go on to create an offspring that is viable, right? So pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms, right? These would be reproductive isolation mechanisms that prevent the formation of a zygote, right? So zygote, two gametes coming together to form that zygote. There are some mechanisms that simply prevent mating from happening at all, right? Versus that post-zygotic isolating mechanisms, right? So maybe individuals can mate with one another, right? But that zygote is either not going to be viable, right? It's going to produce an offspring that's not fertile or have a whole host of other consequences on that individual, all right? We're going to look at these pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms first. I think they're fairly straightforward to understand, all right? The first one is just simply habitat isolation, all right? There's some sort of geographic barrier that prevents contact between two populations, and over time, those two populations will evolve into different habitats, different environments, and no longer be able to breed with one another. All right, so these snails here, we have our starting population. Half the population went to either side of this canyon. They are now geographically isolated. They cannot cross this canyon to breed with one another. And over time, they're going to evolve into different species. Okay. The other type of isolation could be temporal isolation. All right, so the timing isn't right to breed with one another. These crickets are a great example of that. Right? The crickets, they look really similar to each other. Right? I don't know that you could easily tell them apart via morphological characteristics. But if we look at their behavior, right, one of these crickets will only reproduce in the spring, the other will only reproduce in the fall. So temporally, they're going to be unable to breed with one another, right? Because their reproduction, their rhythms do not match up. We have three more types of these pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. One is a behavioral isolation. All right, so behaviors are important in a mate choice. Right? I like this cartoon image from the Amoeba sisters here because birdsong is a great example of a behavioral isolation. Right? A birdsong within a species might be a wonderful way to attract a mate. Right? But to another species, that birdsong might be the most annoying thing you've ever heard, and you do not want to mate with that bird. Right? So these behavioral differences tend to arise. We can have mechanical isolation, right, where it's just physically impossible for them to mate, right? So size of your genitalia are just physically impossible, or maybe mechanistically, right? The genitalia are just not compatible with one another, right? So that would be mechanical isolation. Physically not possible. The other would be gametic isolation, and this would be that maybe you could mate, or maybe the gametes could come in contact with each other, but they are not going to unite successfully to create that zygote. All right, great example of this is wind pollination for plant species, right, where they're kind of just throwing their gametes into the air in hopes that they will meet another gamete and form a zygote, right? Sometimes these gametes will meet, but they just won't unite successfully, likely because they're a different species, right? So these are all pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms, but sometimes, right, mating can occur, right? Individuals from different species could physically mate, right, and form a zygote. But after that zygote is formed, there can be some other mechanisms at play that don't allow for that zygote to develop properly or develop at all, right? This is much less common in nature, right? It takes a lot of energy, right, and resources sometimes for organisms in nature to mate, right? So you don't want to put all this resource or all this energy into mating if you're not going to produce a viable offspring. All right, but sometimes it does happen, right? So if a zygote is produced, it could be simply inviable. So we could have hybrid inviability. That fertilized egg cannot progress past just being an embryo, all right? It's just not going to develop. It is going to fail. It could be that maybe that zygote can progress past an embryo. We can create a new individual, but that individual might be sterile. All right, so a great example of this is the mule, right? This is a cross between a male donkey and a female horse. It creates a mule, right? Mules are common. They can grow. They can live these nice lifespans, all right? But they're sterile. They're not going to be able to produce offspring themselves, all right? And finally, we can have hybrid breakdown, where maybe we get something like a mule, for instance, all right? But there's just so many genetic abnormalities going on that it simply makes life miserable for that organism, and it's just not going to be viable over successive generations, all right? they're going to die out eventually. Even if they can produce offspring, there's just going to be too many problems for that population to persist. All right, so biological species concept really focuses on reproductive isolation, right? But again, we know reproductive isolation has its disadvantages, right? We can't look at this in fossils, right? We don't know how they lived or if they were able to reproduce with other fossils at that time. And species that reproduce asexually, right? We can't apply the same concept to asexual species, right? It can really only be applied to populations that overlap geographically, even though geographic isolation plays a part into a lot of these reproductive isolations, right? A good example of why this concept can be problematic are these hybrid growler bears, right? These are bears that are hybrid between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. Grizzly bear and a polar bear, they are different species. They look different, they have different behaviors, they have different diets, they have different ranges that they inhabit, right? But they can mate together and produce offspring, which is this hybrid growler bear, maybe growler bear is how you would pronounce it. They can produce the growler bear, and that growler bear is perfectly fine, right? It can mate with other growler bears, it can reproduce normally, right? And so that seems like it would be a new species, right? But there's some problems going on there.
Could the polar bear like mate with a grizzly bear or a polar bear, or could it only mate together?
Yeah, all three of these actually can mate together, which biological species concept says if they can't mate, well, I went too far here. If they can mate together, they should be the same species. But we know the grizzly bear and the polar bear are different species. So one of the ways this is problematic. I actually linked a really nice video of Hank Green explaining this situation in the comments to this slide, but also in the additional resources. It's pretty fascinating. I would encourage you to watch that video. It's very short. All right, let's put this into practice. I have an example of dragonfly species here. They exhibit a specialized genitalial structure that prevent them from inseminating females of a different species, right? What type of reproductive isolation is this? Is this pre or post zygotic isolation? And does this mean that the species will not or cannot mate with one another? I'll give you a couple minutes. They're cute. That's a great question. I wonder what the behavior of the offspring would be. Look,
Because polar bears are very aggressive.
look at the
And grizzly
grizzly
bears aren't aggressive until they're provoked. Once they're provoked, like, it's not like, oh, like, lay down on the ground, I'll get bored of you. I can climb trees.
My favorite type of bear is the sun bear. I love sun bears. They look so sweet. Have you ever seen one?
Yes.
I thought I would love sun bears. But I love sun bears.
So, two species that, like, cannot, or, like, could mate together, but just, like, it wouldn't produce, like, an offspring. Do they ever partake in that, or is it just, like,
They could.
yeah?
Yeah, so maybe.
It's just, like, I mean, like, the attempt was made, but nothing.
Exactly. And that would be a good example of like post-zygotic.
Yeah.
Like if they could attempt it and create a zygote,
Yeah.
but something else is going to go wrong down the road.
Yeah.
It's less common because that's a lot of energy needed for something that's just not going to improve your fitness.
Yeah. But do they,
Yeah.
like, know? I mean, I don't know if they know it.
Oh my goodness. All right, forgot to mute that one. Ooh, all right. So hopefully we have all woken up from that one. Oh my goodness. Yes. All right. I apologize. I forgot to mute that audio. And I am now giving you the answer to this first one. So this type of speciation, depending on what type of reproductive isolation, well, they physically cannot mate. Their genitalia are just incompatible. It would be mechanical isolation. Is this pre or post-zygotic isolation?
Pre.
Yeah, pre. You're not even going to make a zygote because you physically can't, right? And what does this mean? Well, the species, will they or can they not? I said that wrong. Two species will not or cannot mate with one another. Yeah, they physically cannot, right? Some species could mate with one another, but then we get into the whole post-zygotic issues that could occur. All right. Any questions that I did not get to or that you might have? Ooh, that police siren really energized me. All right. So let's look at some mechanisms at how speciation can arise. Right? We've looked at how to define species, how to tell species apart, but now let's look at events that cause different species to occur. So, speciation, formation of a new species, right? And it's always going to be these genetic changes that cause a new species, right? The genetic changes might cause behavioral differences, they might cause morphological differences, but something is causing a change that allows them not to, typically not to mate with one another if we're following the biological species concept, right? There are two explanations to why there are different species. And it could be that speciation might occur due to abrupt events causing reproductive isolation. So think about, maybe if a volcano erupted, right, and you have a hot lava flowing down in between a population, you are physically isolating very dramatically these two populations, right? Even after the lava cools, maybe it's hard to pass that lava field, right? They are very abruptly isolated. Or it could be a consequence of adaptation to different ecological niches, which is what we see most often. All right, so a niche is defined as a role that an organism plays in a community, right? This role includes physical and environmental conditions. So where does this organism actually inhabit, right? And the conditions and interactions that it might have with other species, right? So what interactions does this organism have? So if we think about a frog, right, the niche for a frog might be aquatic, right? But we could define it even further in saying that it's aquatic. It's likely shallow water, maybe close to the shore, next to vegetation, and interacting with maybe a lot of bug species around because they eat a lot of insects, right? This is a more common way that speciation will arise, right? Difference in ecological niches, right? So if we look at these patterns in speciation, first of all, cladogenesis would be the term that we would say is the division of species into two or more species, right? So that's the actual act of a species dividing into two species or more would be cladogenesis, right? And so cladogenesis requires a change in gene flow, right? So we can no longer have migration between two different populations. They're reproductively isolated in some manner of speaking, and that's going to lead to new species, right? And this can happen in two different ways. We could have allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. We're going to talk about allopatric speciation first. Right? So allopatric speciation, we've actually already kind of talked about this because it's a speciation that occurs when members of a species become geographically isolated. Right? So allopatric speciation, there's some geographical separation. Right? This can occur very abruptly, or it can be these gradual changes over time that can lead to this isolation. So the squirrel population here, at first we have a small stream separating them, but over time maybe it becomes too deep or too wide for them to interact with each other, they're going to become two different species, right? Another example of this are the porkfish, right? They're a tropical fish found kind of in that Caribbean Sea area around South America and Central America here. They became two different species because of this Isthmus of Panama developing, right? So this physical land separation occurred and split their population in half, right? Those two populations that arose became different species. Even if they came in contact today, they would likely not recognize themselves, right, as coming from the same species because they're so far evolved into two different ones.
So, like, if you brought, like, two species together, would they, like attack us? Or, like, would there possibly be aggression between the two?
There could be. I guess it depends on the behavior of the two species. Hard to predict. Yeah, unless I know like a concrete example. It could be that maybe there's going to be aggression between these two fish. It could be maybe that they try to mate with one another but are unsuccessful because they're so evolved into two different species. Yeah, it's hard to know. All right. Sometimes in allopatric speciation, we might see what's called adaptive radiation. And this can be from when an individual moves to a new environment, right? So it's not a geographic separation that happened in nature, but rather it's a subset of individuals creating this new population elsewhere, right? They're still changing their habitat, but it's on their own accord, essentially. And so one of the really great examples is this Eurasian rosefinch that migrated from Asia to the Hawaiian Islands, right? And once it got to the Hawaiian Islands, there were so many habitats that it could exploit that eventually it evolved into many, many different species, right? It didn't just evolve into a new species. It evolved into, I think there's like tens to hundreds of different species of finches on these Hawaiian Islands, right? They're all inhabiting slightly different ecological niches. Right, so some of them might be nectar feeders or insect eaters or seed eaters, right? All these different habitats that they could exploit. All right, that other type of cladogenesis that we could talk about would be sympatric speciation. And this is where there's no geographical isolation, right? But for whatever reason, they still do not mate, all right? So they're not geographically isolated. There are no physical barriers to interbreeding, but something else is going on that prevents that reproductive isolation. Right? One of these mechanisms is polyploidy. Right? So polyploidy, you think about this happening in meiosis. The chromosomes are not separating out correctly. We get this non-disjunction. So what was supposed to be a diploid species could end up being a tetraploid individual. Right? And if two individuals of that tetraploid mate together, that could create a new species because they have a different number of chromosomes, right? So this is one mechanism that this could occur. This is more common with plants, right? We see a lot more instances of new species via this polyploidy mechanism. But we can also have these adaptations to local environments, right? So this North American apple maggot fly is a great example of this, right? So these maggot flies, they inhabit the same area, right? Traditionally, they fed on the native hawthorn trees. But when apple trees were introduced, right, in the same area, right, so there's nothing separating them geographically, some of these maggot flies preferred the apple trees, right? And the apple trees, they actually mature more quickly, right? So they have a different reproductive cycle. And so over time, it led to this temporal separation of these flies, right? Some were more linked to the apple tree and their reproductive cycle. Some were more linked to the reproductive cycle of the hawthorn trees, right? Now, while they're not currently different species, right, they're kind of following this path of temporal separation that they could eventually become these two different species. So this is a great example of something that is currently happening. All right, let's do another group question here. And I think this is all that we're going to really have time for today. I want you to identify what is the key difference between allopatry and sympatry, right? And using the image, which of the resulting new populations is a result of allopatry or sympatry?
Well, allopatry is like geological, like there's like sympatry is like they just won't. Yeah, if you have time. Geographic separation by slow geographic events or when human migration we don't have shifts to a place that's geographically
All right, what is allopatry and how is that different from sympatry?
geological is allopatry and sympatry is like they just won't make each other.
Yeah, allopatry, there's some geographical isolation. Sympatry, there's something else going on that just they won't mate together. So which one of these is the one showing allopatry? Yeah, the one with the mountain, right? Yes, so that would be allopatry, but we also have sympatric speciation because something caused the subset of trees to be reproductively isolated. Likely polyploidy because we're talking about plants here. All right. Instead of moving on to the new topic in the next 2 minutes here, all right, I'm just going to let you know that study guide is up there and keep working our way at those cumulative questions. All right, I'm hoping to get that content check number 10 up on Moodle by tomorrow.